The room fell silent before the name was even finished. Julius Malema. A ripple moved through the chamber of the Mlanga Commission papers, rustled, a microphone cracked, and then nothing. Silence. For years, South Africa had known Malema as the voice that thundered from the streets into parliament, a man who called himself a revolutionary for the poor, a fighter for the forgotten. But on this day, that same name was whispered with suspicion. Television cameras zoomed in on the faces of stunned MPs. Some lowered their eyes, others looked at each other in disbelief. Outside in the streets of Johannesburg, the radio anchors broke into regular programming. The man who once vowed to burn down corruption was now being linked to the very system he promised to destroy. It was not supposed to end like this. 3 weeks earlier, commentators had raised 2 red flags: strange political maneuvers, unexplained alliances, and a silence that spoke louder than words. Few listened. Most dismissed it as political noise. But when the testimony came out connecting Malema to a web of mining interests and political patronage, it felt less like a scandal and more like prophecy fulfilled. And yet beyond the politics, there's something deeper here, something moral. How does a man who begins as a revolutionary end up as a symbol of the establishment? How do ideals so pure get tangled in greed, ambition, and pride? South Africa's story is no longer just about politics. It's about integrity versus revolution, about what happens when power tests the conscience of those who claim to fight for justice. So stay with me, because before this story ends, we'll revisit the warnings, uncover the patterns, and ask the question no one dares to ask. Can Africa still rise if its revolutions keep losing their soul? Please share this video if you believe that leadership must be grounded in truth, not in slogans. Subscribe if you believe that integrity is the last revolution left to fight for. 3 weeks before Julius Malema's name echoed through the Mlanga Commission, something unusual had already begun to stir. In one of the parliamentary sessions, Malema, usually the loudest voice against corruption, suddenly shifted his tone. He defended a controversial colleague, Bernard, a man whose name had been tied to questionable contracts and internal misconduct. The opposition parties demanded Bernard's recusal, but Malema, he went further than even the ruling DA would. "We're not going to be told what to do by Mkhwanazi," he said firmly. "If we are looking for him, we have to find him. If he's not available, we'll summon him." It was a defiant performance, calculated, angry, and oddly personal. Political analysts watching that day noticed something deeper. Malema wasn't just defending a colleague, he was building a wall. A wall that some suspected he might one day need for himself. The host of the original video reminded viewers of that moment. "Mark this clip," he said 3 weeks earlier. "You will come back and say you were right. When I see a third red flag, that's it. I'll know Julius Malema is hiding something." Then came the day that would confirm everything. At noon, inside the Mlanga Commission, General Shibila, a senior officer, was testifying about the network of illegal mining cartels operating in the Northwest Province. He described a chain of influence stretching from local syndicates to powerful political figures. His tone was dry, methodical, until one name slipped out. Z is a close friend of Julius Malema, who is a politician, connected to General Shibila. The air thickened. Reporters froze their pens mid-sentence. That one connection from Z to Malema set the entire hearing ablaze. By evening, every major outlet had the same headline: Malema named in testimony on illegal mining links. Ironically, Malema was absent from Parliament that very day, the only session he had missed in months. He returned the following morning fiery and composed, leading another hearing, grilling ministers about their corrupt comrades. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. How could the accuser become the accused overnight? The video's narrator played these moments side by side, Malema's confident interrogation of Minister Mkhunu and the commission's testimony connecting him to mining cartels. It was haunting. "Look at his face," the narrator said. "He's speaking about comradeship and loyalty, the very words that will soon turn against him." To many South Africans, this wasn't just about a politician being named in an inquiry. It was about a symbol collapsing under its own weight. Malema had spent years portraying himself as the conscience of the nation, fearless, incorruptible, unbought. He was the man who stood in red overalls and shouted for the poor, for the miners, for the forgotten. And now his name was being whispered in the same breath as the men who exploited those very miners. When General Shibila's words were replayed on evening news, the country split in two. Supporters called it a smear campaign. The system is afraid of Malema, they cried. Others saw poetic justice. He built his fame on accusing others. Now he's tasting his own fire. The story didn't end there. A book surfaced soon after Malema Money Power patronage. It had been years in the making, written by two investigative journalists who claimed to have documented Malema's entire financial web from political favors to business kickbacks. He is talented, one of them said, but talent without restraint is dangerous. This book is about power and how it buys silence. And silence, that was the theme echoing through every corridor of Parliament that week. Malema, the man who once spoke for everyone, now had nothing to say. The revolution had lost its loudest voice and maybe, just maybe, its last ounce of innocence. It was just after noon when the recording of General Shabila's testimony began circulating on national television. By evening, every living room in South Africa had seen the clip. His steady voice, the dim light of the courtroom, the name Julius Malema pronounced like a verdict. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't dramatized, it was simply stated, and yet it shook the country more than any speech could. At first, disbelief filled the air. Malema's supporters within the Economic Freedom Fighters EFF insisted it was impossible. He is being framed, they said. He's the one exposing corruption, not committing it. But as journalists began linking the details, the mining cartels, the business figures from Santon, the unexplained gaps in Malema's financial disclosures, the tone shifted from denial to confusion. What unsettled the public wasn't just the accusation, but the timing. At the exact hour Malema's name surfaced at the commission, he was across town leading a heated parliamentary debate, tearing into Minister Makunu for sharing confidential government letters. "It is your comrade who does that," Malema shouted. "We cannot be blamed when we take up an issue with you sharing a sensitive document." The irony was almost unbearable. As Malema thundered about loyalty and betrayal, the commission's hearing was quietly rewriting his legacy. It was as if two Juliuses existed at once, one condemning corruption, the other being named as its participant. The next morning, the streets of Johannesburg buzzed with mixed emotions. Taxi drivers argued on the radio. Students at Wits University debated in cafeterias. On social media, hashtags collided. Hands off Malema trended alongside Josh Red Flag Leader. The nation was split between disbelief and grim recognition. By afternoon, Parliament was surrounded by protesters, some in red EFF berets, others holding signs that read, "No one above the law." The cameras captured both faces, those still loyal and those deeply betrayed. An elderly woman interviewed outside the building summed up the mood with quiet sorrow. "We believed in him, like we believed in Mandela once. Maybe that was our mistake to believe too easily." In the following days, something deeper began to unravel, the emotional collapse of a movement. Inside, the EFF members whispered about damage control. Spokespersons issued vague statements of solidarity, but few dared to appear on live interviews. Even the party's firebrand youth leaders grew silent. Then came the book launch, Malema Money Power patronage. Excerpts were read aloud on national TV detailing how the EFF's internal funds allegedly blended with private business dealings tied to mining contracts. The revelation felt surgical, not sensational. One journalist said, "We didn't need to accuse him. The paper trail speaks louder than words." In church gatherings, pastors used Malema's downfall as a moral parable. "Talent is a gift," one preacher said, "but without character it becomes a curse." Others saw divine justice at play, that arrogance when left unchecked invites its own destruction. Yet amidst the outrage there were those who refused to celebrate. They looked beyond Malema and saw a mirror held up to an entire generation of African leaders, young, brilliant, defiant, yet vulnerable to the same old traps. "He is not alone," one columnist wrote. "He is the symptom of a sickness, a system that rewards rebellion but punishes wisdom." By the end of that week, Malema appeared briefly in public. No press conference, no fiery speech, just a brief appearance at a community event in Limpopo. The cameras caught him smiling faintly, waving to a crowd that seemed unsure whether to cheer or stay silent. For the first time in years, the man who once commanded every microphone seemed to have lost his words. The country waited for a denial, a confession, a statement, anything. But none came. The silence that followed was louder than his entire career of speeches. And in that silence, South Africa faced a painful realization: the revolution that promised to cleanse the system had begun to mirror it. In the weeks that followed the Mlanga Commission's revelations, South Africa entered a period of quiet turbulence. The streets were calm, but the air felt heavy, as if the entire nation was holding its breath. Political scandals were nothing new here, but this one felt different. This time it touched something sacred, the idea that revolution itself could be corrupted. Within the economic freedom fighters, the storm was internal and visible. Party spokespeople appeared before the press with tight smiles and vague reassurances. The commander-in-chief remains focused, one said, avoiding every question about the commission. Behind closed doors, however, divisions deepened. Some members demanded that Malema step aside until the investigation cleared him. Others, fearing collapse, insisted the party must protect the brand at all costs. The EFF's once fiery rallies lost their fire. Attendance dropped. What used to be a chorus of revolutionary chants became uneasy gatherings filled with uncertainty. One former member described it bluntly to a reporter, "We joined to fight corruption. Now we are asked to defend it." Across the country, ordinary citizens reacted with a blend of exhaustion and betrayal. For years, they had listened to Malema denounce corruption, challenge the elite, and promise a new order where the poor would finally rise. Many had forgiven his outbursts and radical rhetoric because they saw sincerity beneath the anger. But when his name appeared among those accused of manipulating mining deals, something broke. At taxi ranks and market stalls, people no longer debated politics, they whispered about disappointment. "He was our voice," said a miner in Rustenburg, but maybe the system swallowed him too. The statement captured what millions were thinking, that South Africa's revolution had been devoured by the same hunger for wealth it once condemned. The political fallout spread quickly. Opposition parties seized the opportunity. The Democratic Alliance mocked the EFF's silence, calling it the sound of hypocrisy. The ruling ANC, long accused of corruption itself, suddenly found new ground to lecture about integrity. Even smaller parties, often ignored by the media, gained momentum by branding themselves the true revolutionaries. But the damage wasn't only political, it was moral. The young generation that once wore red berets as a symbol of defiance began removing them in public. University students, once inspired by Malema's courage to confront power, now spoke of betrayal. "If even he can fall," one student said during a campus debate, "then maybe there's no honest leader left in this country." Economically, investors grew cautious. The mere association of a top opposition leader with mining cartels sent ripples through an already fragile market. Confidence dipped. Foreign observers called it a credibility crisis, the kind of slow, invisible erosion that weakens institutions from within. Religious leaders, community elders, and civil groups stepped in to calm the storm. Some urged forgiveness. Others demanded accountability. But one message echoed through the churches and town halls alike. Integrity is not optional. It's survival. By the end of the month, the EFF's red flags, once a symbol of resistance, came to represent something darker, the warnings people ignored until it was too late. And while Julius Malema still held his title, the moral authority that had once made him untouchable was gone. The revolution was still alive in name, but its heart had stopped beating. From Washington to London, the Julius Malema scandal made only brief headlines, a few lines in the international sections, buried between updates on elections and foreign markets. Yet, to those who have followed African politics closely, the story carried a far deeper meaning. It wasn't just about one politician's fall. It was a case study in how power tests conviction, no matter where in the world it lives. In the United States, several African studies scholars saw something familiar. "This is the same curve of idealism turning into entitlement," one professor at Howard University told NPR. "We saw it with certain revolutionary figures in Latin America and in our own civil rights movement, heroes who couldn't resist the temptations of power once they held it." His words struck a chord with older Americans who had lived through their own seasons of political disillusionment. They understood that charisma unchecked can decay into corruption faster than any ideology can explain. Cable news panels in New York and Atlanta debated whether Malema's story reflected a wider trend, the global fatigue with leaders who preach justice while practicing privilege. One commentator drew a sharp comparison: from Wall Street to Johannesburg, power always tests moral limits. What's different now is that people see through the performance faster than ever before. In Europe, the reaction was more cynical. Some analysts in London and Paris called the scandal proof that African populism was unsustainable without accountability. French editorials used it to justify skepticism toward the new generation of anti-Western African leaders. Today, Malema, tomorrow Traoré. One headline sneered, suggesting that movements of reform and sovereignty would eventually fall to the same human weaknesses. But others, especially within the Pan-African community, pushed back. Voices from Ghana, Burkina Faso, and the diaspora in America and the Caribbean reminded the world that not all revolutions are born from corruption. They pointed to President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso as an example of integrity under pressure, a young soldier leading by restraint rather than rhetoric. Traoré's rise, one columnist in The Guardian Africa wrote, shows that moral courage can still exist inside power if the leader remembers where he came from. In the American South, many older viewers, veterans of the civil rights era, found that line hauntingly familiar. They remembered Martin Luther King Jr.'s warning, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice only if we keep bending it." Watching Malema's unraveling, they saw not an African tragedy, but a universal caution that justice without humility becomes tyranny dressed as freedom. Across talk shows and online forums, one question began to surface again: can Africa rise on integrity rather than anger? For the global audience, Julius Malema's scandal became more than an African story. It became a mirror reflecting the uncomfortable truth that every society from Washington to Ouagadougou wrestles with the same dilemma: how to build change without becoming what it once opposed. And as the headlines faded, one image remained: a young man in a red beret, once fearless, now silent, and the echo of a continent still searching for leaders who can hold both power and conscience in the same hand. The cameras are off now. The microphones are cold. Julius Malema no longer commands the headlines that once trembled at his words. But in the quiet that followed, something far more important remains: a lesson carved into the conscience of a continent. The fall of Malema isn't simply the story of a man accused. It is the story of a movement losing its compass. He once spoke for the poor, the miners, the youth who felt invisible. He spoke of justice, equality, and revolution. Yet somewhere along the way, those words began to serve ambition more than conviction. And when ambition replaces purpose, the revolution devours its own children. South Africa has seen this before: hope rising fast, collapsing faster. Each time, the tragedy isn't that leaders fail, but that ordinary people stop believing that integrity still matters. Cynicism grows, and soon the entire society begins to decay from within. That is the real danger, not the fall of one man, but the quiet acceptance that this is just how power works. But it doesn't have to be. Across the continent, a different kind of leadership is emerging, one that values humility over applause, service over slogans. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré continues to remind the world that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands firm. He represents what Malema could have been: proof that courage can exist without corruption, that patriotism can walk hand in hand with morality. And yet the question remains for all of us in Africa, in America, everywhere: can a generation that has witnessed so many broken promises still believe in leaders who choose conscience over comfort? Because if we stop believing that integrity is possible, we will stop demanding it. And when people no longer demand honesty, corruption stops hiding, it celebrates. So let this story not end with shame, but with awakening. Let Malema's silence become a warning, and Traoré's example a reminder that the fight for Africa's soul is not over. It's only changing hands. If you still believe that integrity is the final revolution, share this story. If you believe that Africa's future depends on truth, not slogans, subscribe and stand with those who lead by example, not ambition. Because revolutions may begin with anger, but only integrity can keep them alive.